Hello everyone, and welcome to today's session, Developing a Cybersecurity Roadmap, How to Plan for Success. My name is Shannon Lane and I will be your moderator for today. It's a pleasure to welcome you and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us. We have a great agenda for you. We'll be offering actionable insights into developing a cybersecurity roadmap. And as you may know, an effective security roadmap is a challenging process that involves a number of moving parts. Factors that need to be considered include an organisation's compliance and risk posture, the policy framework, your ability to detect and respond to vulnerabilities and intrusions, and also your resiliency and ability to recover from a breach. Now a little bit about our speaker for today. Mark Hofman is the Chief Technology Officer at Shearwater Solutions and has over 25 years of experience in ICT security. He has worked for both private industry and government and has provided a wide range of information security consulting services to numerous organisations. Mark is a certified instructor for the SANS Institute. He has written a number of publications, has trained and lectured internationally, and is a handler for the Internet Storm Centre. Mark holds a wide range of professional and industry certifications. And I'll hand over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Shannon. All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. So what we're going to be talking about is basically developing the security roadmap. So developing that roadmap usually comes after being asked some pointed questions, usually in an inconvenient spot like the elevator or the kitchen by the CEO. So we'll have a quick chat about those different questions that executives actually want an answer to. We'll also talk about what good security actually looks like, because it's really difficult to make a good roadmap when you don't really know what you're aiming for. And then, of course, if you're aiming for something, you need to know where you start off from. So we'll talk about that and how to get to that next stage. So let's have a talk about what executives typically ask. These are the ones that I get asked all the time. So, are we compliant? Are we secure? My favorite one. Are we secure usually comes with, can you give me that in a traffic light graph with red, yellow, and green? So now, if you're honest, in most organisations without context, that probably will always be red. So we'll try and make that a little bit more greener today. The other question you often get asked is, are we more secure compared to last year? And we'll go through some of those questions, because individually they don't necessarily make a lot of sense, or they're quite difficult to answer. But if you ask them all together and kind of understand the intent behind them, then it allows you to put your roadmap together and give a sensible answers to the executives. Now, this won't be a surprise to many of you. Okay, are we compliant is a kind of a loaded question, because you can be compliant, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're secure. You can get there, and there's a lot of things in compliance requirements and standards, etc., that will help you become secure. But unless you kind of live and breathe it, it's not going to do too much. Likewise, you can be secure and not compliant. We see that quite a lot of the time. We see organisations that have very good security practices and operations happening in the organisation, but they're terrible at documenting stuff. So from a compliance perspective, which often include a lot of documentation requirements, those guys won't be compliant, but they are still secure. So again, a little bit of a loaded question. The one I like is, how did we go compared to last year? Again, that's a difficult question to answer, because, well, last year, the landscape that we were working with was different. The attacks that we had last year, there might have been a few attacks, whereas the attacks that we see now, they can be vastly different. That's one of the big things that I like about information security. Everything changes and everything stays the same. So the everything stays the same is that a lot of the processes and procedures and things that we have to do from an operational perspective, they don't necessarily change that much over time. But the attacks and how we are broken into and how we need to deal with them, that changes every day. So there's a bit of both there. So, more compared to what last year, how the world was last year, how what we were doing last year, because if your security effort hasn't changed over the last 12 months, then last year you were doing fantastic. The types of attacks that you were seeing, you know, you were dealing with it. But if you're still doing the same thing now as you were doing 12 months ago, then there's a fair chance that the attacks might have overtaken what your current effort is. So individually, these questions can be quite a bit of a pain. This question I actually do like, and we do get asked this one a lot. What do we do in case of a breach or an attack? Now, this is a great question to be asked when the person asking it's just returned from a seminar or a conference and things like that, and actually, you know, their awareness has been raised, and they're asking the question to find out whether you're prepared for an attack. Although too often we get this one, and then the first question that goes through your head is, so what's actually happened to make you ask this question in the first place? So we do see this question asked from staff or people like yourselves when there's actually an incident, and it's kind of, you know, better take the lift back up to your desk to see what's actually going on in that particular instance. All four of them, though, yeah, there's actually kind of a subtext to the question that CEOs and executives are actually asking. When they ask what are we compliant, what they're really asking is what standards do we need to meet or exceed? You know, have we met them? Do we continue to meet them? What have we got in place to meet them? The are you secure one is more along the lines of, okay, well, do we actually understand our current risks? Do we know our key assets? Are we protecting those key assets? That's the question that's really being asked. Are we more secure than last year? Well, what's changed in the last 12 months? Okay. How are we meeting those new challenges? Where did we improve? How did we improve? And then, of course, for the last one, for the incident one, what incidents have actually occurred? How did we handle them? What did we learn? How did we adapt? What did we change to make sure that we met that challenge? That's really what the executive is asking when he's asking any one of these four questions. But if you ask them in isolation, they can be difficult to handle. Combined, they can actually give you a nice picture of where the organization lies within the security structure. So on that, we've actually got a poll question. And just a quick interlude there then. So are your executives more aware or less secure organization security risks than they were 12 months ago? You should see that on your screen right now. So are they less aware, more aware, or no real change? If you can answer that, then we can continue on in a few seconds.
We'll probably allow just 30 seconds to continue that, to answer that question.
So thanks for that. So knowing where you are, oops, there we go. So knowing the questions that you're going to be asked, okay, you need to have an understanding of where you are or where you need to aim for. So what does good security actually look like? So this is this caused quite a heated discussion in the office, quite a lively one. But what we kind of came up with was a consensus view that, yeah, good security needs to be proactive. There's a lot of organizations where the security teams are purely reactive. We react to new projects going live. I suspect that pretty much everybody that's online has had the situation where they've, you know, Friday afternoon, it's 4 p.m., someone comes along to your desk and basically says, hey, this project needs to go live in a few hours. Can you please approve it? Okay, so that's something that we need to stop. And all the way throughout my career, I've always kind of tried to focus on getting organizations to change from a reactive security team to a proactive security team. But to do that, you actually need that roadmap. You need to develop that roadmap to understand where you're going to go. And there's a few other things that you need to have in place. We'll talk about that as well in a minute. Security, unobtrusive, you know, in-your-face security often generates obstacles. So the security team, we exist to enable the business, to allow the business to do what they need to do in a secure manner. And nobody ever thanked a security team for saying no constantly. There's obviously a case for saying no under certain circumstances, because there are plenty of things that are just plain bad idea from a security perspective. But ideally you'll have a security team that's actually going to be beneficial to the organisation. The right coverage needs to happen. So this is for the tools and things like that. So a lot of tools that are in place, we purchase a lot of stuff. We play around with a lot of stuff. We configure it, we let it run, and then in many organizations it just sits there for the rest of the year or the rest of its natural life. We come across systems that after it's been implemented, it's never been touched. So it's, it does what it's supposed to do, but tools do need kind of a little bit of love. Same thing with the right technology and controls. I'll go through a little bit of a maturity model in a second, but for example, if your organization is at the we have a firewall and antivirus stage, then your next purchase is probably not going to be a full packet capture solution to grab everything and do full analysis. There's technologies in between that you probably want to have a look at. Good security requires risk management, obviously, because we need to understand what the risks are. We need to understand what we're going to do about them and minimize them. We need to be cost effective. A security solution that's going to cost 2-3 times the annual revenue of the company is probably not going to do it much good. So we need to understand that, and of course understand the current threats. So if your security team doesn't have a grasp of what's happening now in the world, then they have a little bit of work to do. The last two are probably the most important ones, to be honest. Whatever you do, it needs to be repeatable. So I've worked in security teams, just like you guys, where you've solved the same problem over and over and over again. So if you can fix that, so solve a problem once and then move along, then you actually have a much happier life. You become a more proactive security team, and you can focus on the fun stuff as opposed to the kind of the drudgery stuff that needs to happen on a day-to-day basis, or the things that you're fixing over and over again. And of course document it, but we put that in every presentation because documentation is important, and we all kind of stink at it a little bit, and to be honest, myself included. So what does it take? So when we were looking at what does it take to get good security, there's 4 main functions that have to happen in an organization. You need to have some sort of risk and compliance or governance function. So to help you identify what you need to protect and how well you're doing it, that's what that function's for. You typically have some sort of security architecture and design component within an organization. So this is a team that liaises more closely with the business to try and understand what the requirements are for the business and what projects needs to go ahead and what the impacts are and things like that, and how am I going to protect it and how will I know that it's done well. So security administration function, that's a fairly standard, adding users, deleting users, give access, take access away, do some reviews and things like that. And then we've got security operations, which is detect, respond, and identify what's coming your way. Now, we kind of split off security administration and security operations as a separate function, because security administration is often handed over to things like service desks or other teams, or maybe even outsourced. So the security operations keeps an eye on security administration from that perspective. Now, depending on your maturity, okay, you might have all 4 functions, you might only really have the 1 function. And as we'll see in a second, you can kind of have a sliding scale of which functions do you have, kind of gives a quick indication of the maturity of the organization. Let's first say, for example, take risk and compliance. If there's no real risk and compliance function in the organization, then the maturity is probably going to be less than an organization that has that well and truly sorted. So what does it take for each one of those areas? Well, risk and compliance, to do that properly, you need to have your assets identified, your risks known, your controls selected, your metrics, your policies in place, etc. And of course, as a documented rinse, lather, and repeat process. Security architecture, one of the key things there is early engagements. Can't stress that enough. The earlier you get into a project, even if it's just to say, you know what, security is not interested in this project, there's no impact, we don't care. That is a decision that's being made, as opposed to at the end find out that someone's put a database somewhere on the internet and you're connecting to it using HTTP. and code has been downloaded from a Russian website that's now embedded as part of your core application. That'd be nice to find out at the start, not at the back. So defined security services is good. That's a sign of nice security architecture as well. If someone comes along and says, hey, I want to authenticate, then someone rips out a piece of paper and says, hey, this is how you do it. So good interaction with the business and, of course, the right tools in place. To kind of win at security administration, you typically have to have some defined processes. Regular review and maintenance is what you're looking for. And security operations, that's kind of the everything else bucket, to be honest. But the main objective there is to get visibility on networks, servers, and endpoints, make sure that the tools cover what you're supposed to call the tool cover, have appropriate configuration of them, have response capability and threat management and analysis. Now, the skills and things like this for all of these tasks, they don't necessarily need to be only within your organization. It's quite okay to get someone else to do some of these tasks. Your organization doesn't necessarily exist to be a security business, but the function has to occur and it has to be done by someone. So some of these tasks you can easily outsource. For example, incident response, that's often handed off, or forensics response, that's often handed off to a specialist organization. But some of the other tasks can easily be split off as well. If you want to be a bit more formal about it, you can use some frameworks. So this is kind of just a little bit of a map of the NIST framework. We kind of like that one because it's fairly straightforward. It's only got 5 elements in there. Identify, detect, respond, response, and recover. But if I've kind of mapped the risk and compliance and those 4 functions to those different areas, and as you can see, it covers all of the bits and pieces that we actually need. Okay. So let's go and have a look to see where you sit. Now, there's different ways of doing this, right? So there's obviously a very high level, and to be honest, the more immature you are, the easier this process is going to be for you, okay? Because you can fairly well start with, the non-existent. We have a firewall, we have AV, okay? If that's the answer to the question of what are you doing for information security, then you're probably going to be in that non-existent bucket down the bottom there. So that makes life easy because your roadmap is do anything. So we'll talk about that a little bit further. So the immature organization, typically you'll have some sort of security administration function. You might have some policies. You might not really have any policies. People just kind of know what to do. And yes, that is something that we hear quite a lot of. People magically know what to do. And then you might have some technical controls beyond your firewall or your AV that you might have in place within the organization. Maybe you've ticked an extra box in your AV that says we're doing some threat management. That still kind of is a fairly immature organization. There's no real plan to move forwards. Then the next one we ended up calling doing our best. So security admin function is working pretty well. You're adding users, you're removing users, you've got some policies or you're developing the policies. You're developing maybe a little bit of a risk and compliance or security operations capabilities, technical controls, the basic configuration with some customization. So your tools aren't just sitting there as the default tools that you bought on day one. They've actually had some thought and configuration assigned with them. Then the one that we call getting there. Security administration is working. The policies are defined and communicated. Everybody knows what they are. The security operations are starting to work. You're having some visibility in the network. You've got some logs. People are looking at those logs. They respond to things that they find in those logs. Your risk and compliance function is occurring. You're actually having a bit of a risk assessment throughout the year, and you're determining where you sit for the main risks. And your technical controls are pretty well sorted out. And you're starting to get involved in projects. So, and maybe not at the end. Maybe you're getting somewhere in the middle. But obviously the objective is to try and get that at the start. So then we've got the mature organization. So same sort of things, but the security architecture and design is starting to get established and is working really well, or starting to work. So you've got things documented. Security operations, you've improved on your visibility. The policies are in place. They're regularly being reviewed, so that's important as well. Policy that hasn't been reviewed for a few years doesn't really exist. And the technical controls are in place as well. And then, of course, we have the kind of nirvana, which is the very mature organization. You've got metrics in place, so you're doing everything that you were doing, but you've got metrics in place. You can actually tell when things are working or functioning properly. You have a documented security architecture, so now you have that piece of paper and you can show them that this is how you do authentication within this organization. You might already start to automate some admin functions or operations functions. You're reducing your response times to incidents. You're actually noticing incidents, which is always a good bonus. Policies are in place, technology is in place, and maybe you're starting to look at the advanced tools that are deployed within your organization. So once you get to this 4-5 level, if you're starting to look at some of the advanced tools, which I'll show you in a second, if you're starting to look at these before this, then you're potentially not spending your money wisely. Unless, of course, it's directly addressing a risk that you've identified, in which case it's always a good thing. So so far we've kind of got two ways of determining where you sit. Number one is, am I doing any one of those four main functions, the risk and compliance, the security operations, the security administration, etc. So they're kind of the four main things. Are you doing any of those? If the answer is no, then maybe that's an area that you need to go to. We gave you a little bit of a sliding scale of we have a firewall to nirvana. The other way of looking at where you sit might be to just look along that slide. You can go a little bit further and maybe add some maturity to that. So there are different information security models that all give you different definitions of the maturity of your environment, etc. So there's a whole swag of them: COVID, OpenISMs, and NIST are probably the more common ones. But you could also check your maturity against, for example, ISO 27001, or if you're federal government, the ISM, or if you're in PCI, against PCI. And the one that we use is kind of the one that comes out of COVID 4, in fact. So the reason we use that is because it makes it fairly straightforward to actually break things into smaller chunks. So the scale there is just non-existent through to optimize. So non-existent, you don't have it. Initial ad hoc is, you'll do it when you get round to it. Repeatable, you have a process, but maybe it's not written down, but people kind of know what to do. Defined, it's actually written down what needs to get done. And then managed and monitored is, you've got it written down, you're managing on a regular basis, you've got some metrics in place, and then optimized is where you're starting to add a whole bunch of things to it. The third approach is to basically answer a bunch of questions, and this will likely end up as a little tool on our website, by the way, not necessarily with these specific questions, but this is another way of finding out. So, deciding where you are. If you're not quite sure, then go through the questions and decide for yourself. So, for example, do you have policies? So if the answer is yes, well, okay, is one of them called an acceptable use policy? And if the answer is yes, fantastic. Do you have an information security policy? Have you got any other policies? And for all of these questions, there's kind of the sub-questions. And is it documented, and do people actually know it exists? We were doing an audit in one organization probably about a year or so ago, and we were talking about software development lifecycle policies and procedures and guidelines and things like that, especially secure coding. And the interviews we were doing, the people said, no, we don't have that, we don't have that, we don't have that, we don't have that. So until in the kitchen we were talking about it, and someone else piped up and says, oh, actually, yeah, that documentation does exist, it's over here. Now, it wasn't called an SDLC, it wasn't called secure coding guidelines, it was something completely arbitrary, but he was probably about the only person that knew that it existed. So, that question is very important. Is it documented, and do the right people know it exists? So to get your maturity again, is there a risk assessment process? Do you have an asset register? And we'll talk more about asset registers in a minute, because what you might have in your head might be slightly different to what I have in my head. So, but we'll fix that discrepancy. If your crown jewels left the organization, would you know? Would you recognize them? Okay, that's quite typical of organizations to not necessarily know what they have in their environment. We see that a lot. So when you ask where is your most crucial data, the answer is, oh, I'm not really quite sure. Do you know where they are now? And the answer of do you know where they are now, we often get, oh yeah, they're on the network share, or they're on this machine here. And then when you start talking a little bit further, you'll find out that they're on iPads, they're on Android machines, they're on phones, they're on laptops, they're in home shares, they're on Dropbox, they're on OneDrive. So data never lives where you expect it to. It always lives somewhere else as well. Yeah. This one goes more towards security administrations. How many dormant accounts exist? That can be a good indicator of whether this function is actually working or not. Again, in one organization, we went and did this exercise, and we identified a dormant account, and the person had actually died like 15 years beforehand, but they were still kind of keeping the account just in case he was coming back. I'm not really quite sure how that was going to work, but they just never cleaned up any accounts. So how accessible is your data? When did you have a security awareness training course? How are accounts created? Do you copy and paste them? Copy and paste is always a fantastic practice. You get someone who's been in the organization for 40 years and you copy and paste their account and give it to the new guy. Not necessarily the nicest way of going about it. So if that's you guys, then you're probably slightly dropping down in a maturity level. If the answer is, hey, yeah, we do this all nice and clean and we clean up accounts and fantastic, then you're kind of creeping up in that function. So you can give yourself a maturity score for each one of these questions as well. How well are you doing this? And then, of course, from an operational perspective, the one that kind of close to my heart, when you look at your logs, when does something break? Do you look at your logs when stuff breaks? Do you look at your logs when you get told, hey, there might be a breach? Or you look at your logs every day, all day, and you have it documented in the right know, people know it exists? That'll give you a different maturity score. So for all of these, you can apply your maturity scores. Maybe what you look for becomes important. So if you're not quite sure what you're looking for, then again, your maturity is probably going to be slightly less than if you have an answer of, yeah, we've actually got a use case directory that we consult and we update and we manage. Do you collect the right information? We find this in incidents responses all the time. Yep, we have the right information. The one I did was it was a funds transfer essentially. And the answer was, well, do you have the machine where the funds were transferred from? No, that's overseas at the moment. Okay, well, do you have any server logs, Active Directory logs? No, we don't have those either. Okay, what about firewall logs? Yes, we've got firewall logs. And then, of course, when we looked at the firewall logs, they were only logging denies. So that was a bit useless as well. So, having the right logs is definitely important, and again, a sign of maturity. The more mature organizations will have a process around it, will have it thought out. The other way to look at it is maybe, and again, you can apply these maturity scores to these different areas, is looking at your different technologies. So on the left, you kind of have the more basic stuff that most organizations will have, and then on the right, you've got the beyond the basics, things that organizations are thinking about and maybe you have implemented because of a specific risk, but otherwise should probably be looking at a little bit later on in their life, in the maturity life. But again, that maturity score, you can apply it both to the process as well as the technology, which is what we do. So for example, for firewalls, we will have a process score of that 0 through to 6. Actually, there we go. We can put a process score on it for firewall management. Okay, do you manage your firewalls? No, when we think about it. So, okay, maybe that's a 1. Have you got a defined process? Yeah, actually we do. So maybe that becomes a 3. But then you can also apply it on the technology level. So, for example, the firewalls, do you have them implemented in areas within your business that they typically should be implemented? So maybe towards your internet connections. Well, yes, you do. So maybe that gives you a 3. So you can apply the scores both on technology as well as process. And again, once you have that, Why do we want to apply maturity scores? Because that just makes it easier to track any improvements in progress coming along. It also, if you're doing this against technology, it quickly brings to the fore any technologies that you're not managing that well. So, for example, intrusion detection and prevention systems, we often find that people just kind of switch it on, and then after that, it just sits there. So there's no real process that goes along with it. You know, but that becomes obvious when you start talking to the different teams and the different people in the organization that deal with those boxes, and you can quickly find a maturity level. Brings us to incident response plans. Same sort of deal. When was it last used, etc. And of course the lessons learned. And as an incident response plan, we see them in many organizations where the incident response plan is actually defined and it's never used. So whenever an incident occurs, they do anything other than what's in the incident response plan, which is a little bit disappointing to see. Most of the time that's because either people don't necessarily know the plan exists, but other times it's just because the plan doesn't actually address what's happening at the moment. So in which case, you know, lessons learned, go and fix the plan. Things to look at, you know, were the recommendations accepted and implemented? So that comes out of the incident response. How soon was the machine compromised again? I kind of put that in as a little bit of a chuckle for myself, to be honest, because if you have an incident response plan, the machine shouldn't get compromised again. However, unfortunately, we do see that quite a lot. In fact, last year, I think my 2 days of my life were taken up by answering the phone call saying, oh, your machine got compromised again. All right, we'll be right over to fix it again this time. So the people just kind of didn't quite implement any of the recommendations to get the machine fixed and back online. So basically they just recovered the compromised host and then were surprised when the hackers got straight back into that machine. So, you know, how was security improved in that particular instance? Not at all. In the end, I did have to tell them good luck, but my phone was going on silent after that. So it does happen, hopefully not to anybody listening here. So applying it back to the framework, yeah, we've got those identifiers. So I had the little risks here. So for example, now if you were looking at the NIST cyber framework, you can look at the different components there, and then I've got the functions there. So how well is the risk and compliance function doing asset management, which is the second one down in identify? Well, in this case, they're not actually doing any asset management, so I get a 0 for that. But if you go across security administration, well, they actually have a register of all the laptops that they've issued. So they're actually doing that component quite well. And if you go across to security operations, they have a repeatable process, not documented, but they, because they're doing, I don't know, vulnerability scanning, they actually have a good grasp of what assets are connected to the network. So, yeah, overall, there is something happening, but it's not actually formalized. So that might be an area that you could improve on within that particular organization. So yeah, there's different ways of identifying where you are, and different approaches will give you something more measurable or less measurable depending on where you are. I would suggest that if your maturity level is quite low, then I would probably start working on the big ticket items first. If your maturity level is established or you're moving along, then you probably want to go into a lot more detail. Okay, which brings us to another poll question, actually. So Mikhail will just put that up for you now. What best describes your organization's plan for information security and compliance? So select one of the following: have a plan and actively measuring the security and compliance, currently developing a security compliance plan, or will develop a plan in the next months. We'll give that 30 seconds or so, and then we'll move along. Okay, thank you for that. Those of you that answered, much appreciated. So how do I get to the next stage? All right. So this is where we start thinking and building about our roadmap. So before it was just kind of, knowing the answers that we're going to have to answer, knowing what security, hopefully should look like, and identify a little bit where your gaps might be or where you sit within the maturity level. So now we need to kind of move it along a little bit and start improving things. So obviously the first thing, identify what you're protecting. That's the main thing. What are your crown jewels? Where are they, etc.? What are you protecting it from? So this is essentially risk assessment. So the first one is asset management. The second one is risk assessment and threat management. What are your main concerns, or as I like to put it, what are the CEO's main concerns? Now, CEO main concerns and from a security perspective, main concerns might not necessarily line up. Depends on which conference they went to or which newspaper they were reading at that particular time. But it's a realistic concern because, well, it's the CEO, so you need to address it. But the most important thing is the last one, which is what would hurt the organization most. You need to be able to identify as a security professional what's going to hurt your organization and what are you doing at the moment that's actually putting that at risk. How do we get there? Well, the way that we start is we actually look at the business objective of the organization. So in this case, for example, build the best widgets is what I've got there. Looking at the business objective, every organization has a reason for existing. Government agencies do, state government agencies do, every business lives to do something. And contrary to popular belief, it's probably not to make money, it's to make money, but to make money you do something and you do that well. So identify that and then look at the critical information that you need in order to achieve that. Once you've identified the critical information to do that, you look at the systems that contain that information. I'm going through an example in a second, so it'll become a bit more clear. Once you've identified a system, well, then you can actually go to the IT area and find out which components make up that particular system. So I'll go through an example here. So building the best widgets. So we're just going to go through that and say, okay, well, to build the best widgets and sell them and make money, I need to have customer information, I need to have financial data, I need to have our super secret source process to make our best widgets, and maybe correspondence. Okay, so that's a fairly easy process, straightforward. You can do that, in 10 seconds flat, probably off the top of your head, I would suggest. Then it gets a little bit harder, probably, and you might need to go and talk to some people. But for example, the customer data, when you ask, well, where does that customer data live? Well, some of it will live in a CRM, and maybe most of it will live in a CRM, it might live in a cloud marketing system. Financial data, maybe you've got an SAP or a finance one or something along those lines. Your super secret source process, maybe that just lives in your local wiki, and your correspondence, that just sits on a file server. So now we know what the business objective is. We know what the critical information is in order to build those best widgets. We know the systems that they're living in, which is the CRM, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we go to the last step, which is, okay, so what components actually make up that system? So the CRM in this case is made up of server A, server B, and NAS A. Okay. So what do I know now? I know now that if something happens to server A, I'm not going to have a CRM, which means that I won't have customer data, which means I probably won't be able to sell widgets. Okay. If server B goes down, okay, well, server B actually lives with the CRM and SAP on the same server. Maybe that's already a risk that we should be addressing. But I know that if server B disappears and server C disappears, I'm not going to have any SAP. Okay. If I'm actually manufacturing, maybe I'm driving my manufacturing process through SAP as well, in which case, maybe my factory floor actually stops. So by looking at it this way, what you're capturing is your information assets, which is your critical information in that second column there, okay? And you're also capturing your physical assets. Now, there is kind of a step a little bit further on, which is supporting components. But if you get to this stage, I suggest that you're probably already in a good spot to identify what your critical data is and where it actually lives within your organization, which is kind of step one. Identifying threats to the organization. Well, yeah, there are, like I said, there are a few different lots of different ways of doing it. I've seen people sit in a room and then just basically throw out ideas of, I don't know, a person can walk into the building with a Molotov cocktail and throw it down the lift well, which will burn our data center access, and we won't be able to use our computers. Okay, that's all fine and very creative, but that doesn't necessarily make the process fast. Okay, so what we often start with is what's happened to me. Okay, has anything happened to me? Oh, well, we've had CryptoLocker over the last 12 months. Okay, well, that's probably going to be a threat for us. What's happened to those in my industry? Well, strangely enough, CryptoLocker for them as well, but their websites are being attacked. Okay, and what's happening in general? Well, you know, Cisco's just had a nice, nasty issue on their firewalls. Okay, and that's being exploited in the wild. So maybe that's going to be affecting you as well. And then, of course, based on your key assets, what worries you the most? Okay, so identifying the threats at a high level, pretty straightforward when you start looking at this. This is all typically available on the internet. You can download the various industry reports, like the Verizon Data Breach one, the Ponemon, and most security vendors will actually put out some sort of report. Just remember that whoever puts out the report, they will typically slant the questions / results a little bit towards whatever industry they happen to be in. So you do have to read it with a grain of salt, but it doesn't mean you discard all the information. If you need to go a little bit more detail, what we often do is we'll have these risk categories or threat categories. Okay, so for example, for my system, instead of thinking of all kinds of different scenarios, we use these categories to try and focus your thoughts. So for example, malware affecting systems, which is about middle way through the list there. Malware affecting systems. Okay, let's have a think about how can malware get into the organization. Well, it can get in via email, it can get in via web, it can get in via USB, and maybe instant messaging. Okay, so that's the different vectors in which malware can get into the organization. All right, now let's have a look at what controls we have in place. Well, we're using I don't know, a Message Labs or a Mimecast for the email. We're using a proxy content filtering with an AV and maybe a sandbox. So those are the controls that we have in place. So by thinking about these different categories, you can start thinking about how can that happen to me? And what do I need to have in place, or what do I have in place already? So it helps you identify the gaps really quickly, and without too much effort. Then the final step of that, of course, is to put some sort of risk level to it. So most organizations, the more mature ones, you will have your own internal risk assessment processes already. So I would suggest you fit in with them. If you don't, feel free to use the information on this slide for that. It's based on ISO 31000, so that's the International Risk Assessment Standard. And it's pretty straightforward. You have a likelihood of something occurring, you have an impact that it might have on your organization, and then depending on the impact and the likelihood, you will end up with some sort of score. From an organizational perspective, you'll decide that anything that's low, we're not going to address, we're just going to monitor it just to make sure it doesn't get worse. Anything else, we're going to remediate. Put that into a treatment register, prioritize it. So look at your high risks, identify the treatments that you're going to do, identify the easy wins, the high cost, the biggest impacts, and the most difficult to achieve. And by most difficult to achieve, you might want to consider user impact or user resistance as well. So some controls will have higher levels of resistance to being implemented. If you need an idea of what certain things will do, have a look at the ASD website, so www.asd.gov.au. They have their essential 8 and mitigating controls there, but they actually have a nice little table that kind of suggests how much user objection you will have to implementing certain things. So, and then think of the questions that you're going to be asked at the start. Which of the items are going to take you from a 0 through to a 2? So from non-existent to doing our best, or from doing our best to a mature organization. And that is what's going to become your roadmap. Okay. Make sure that you set achievable goals. So on the roadmap, sure, have everything on there that you would like to do, but then you're going to need to pick what's going to be achievable. Yeah, nobody's ever said we'll finish this identity and access management project in less than 6 months. I'm pretty sure that's not a sentence that exists. But yeah, you need to make sure that you can achieve them. Start with the basics. If you don't have policies, start with those. I know it's sexy to start with the tools, but the policy drives your efforts. And I'm not talking war and peace here, and I'm not talking about 80 different policies. You know, acceptable usage policy, information security policy. Just start with those two, and that helps you drive your rest of your effort. Tools currently in place. Have a look at what you've already got. Have a look at what you can do with it. A lot of people are surprised when you remind them that, you know, your antivirus products, it can actually do intrusion detection as well. Just have to do the little tick box. So address the high risk areas first. I know this is not rocket science, but yeah, it's worth still stating. So how do you sell that to management? Yeah, address the business angle. Make sure that if you go to a manager and say, oh, we need a new firewall, they're probably going to go, oh, okay, what for? But if you need a new firewall or a new remote access solution to more securely give people access to data or actually allow them to do more away from the office, then that's probably going to get much more airplay with the execs. How does it help the business? What does it prevent? Keep it short, try and put cost and benefit in there, and always link it back to the risk. So if you're doing stuff that doesn't link back to risks, then probably eyes start glazing over quite quickly. And use the compliance angle. Yeah, if your organization has a regulatory or contractual or legal obligation to do something, don't be shy in actually pointing that out. You know, that they're often overlooked, but sometimes, you know, that is your best weapon / asset / convincing talking point to get it over the line. But I find addressing the business angle and identifying how it helps the business is more often the winner anyway. And then you can put your roadmap together. So your roadmap itself, so this is just an example one that we did. Yeah, where are we now? So it's actually got all the individual items. This one's quite detailed. Yours might not be, that's okay. And then what we need to do is in the middle there, so different objectives. So in this case, we've got policies and processes, cybersecurity framework, data backup strategy, log management, incident response. So we've divided it up into main objectives and put it on a timeline. And then on the right-hand side, we've kind of put a reminder of what we wanted to achieve and how we wanted to get there. Okay. So yeah, the roadmap, making a roadmap, it doesn't have to be laborious. You can start high and start working your way down. As you mature, you will start going into more details. You will start going into more depth. As you mature, you'll start putting more metrics into place. As you mature, you'll start getting into the nitty-gritty and addressing the things. But you know, start with the big bang things and work your way through. And maybe it's as simple as trying to move up that ladder from 0 through to 5. And with that, we've got one more poll question for you. Do you regularly measure and report on security and compliance to stakeholders in your organization? Simple one, only a yes or no question there, so no decision needed. We'll give people a few seconds to answer.
Right, that's fantastic. Thank you, Mark. We would now like to open up the discussion for questions. While we run through those questions, we might just give you the results of those polls as well, so you can have a bit of a look at those. First question we've got, Mark, is how often should you reevaluate your security roadmap?
I think the security roadmap is probably a living document. So you'll be evaluating it as you move along. You typically would look at it, you know, at the different milestones. So as you're achieving an objective, you probably want to revise to make sure that the roadmap still makes sense. And whenever you do a major risk assessment, because the risk assessment might identify things that you should be changing or doing differently. Because remember, the security landscape changes quite regularly.
Okay, fantastic. Second question, any recommendations regarding metrics or architecture frameworks?
Oh, throw a bunch of names in the air and catch the one that you like the look of. Metrics are quite tricky. So 27, and I want to say 4, I think is the metric one. That one's not a bad framework. To be honest, it will probably tell you, well, it actually does tell you, build a metrics framework and decide what you're going to measure. But then when you get to the bottom of the document, it actually has some sensible metrics on things like, you know, measuring your policies and security awarenesses and things like that. NIST has their own security metrics framework, which again is quite wordy, but it has got a few little snippets in there. To be honest, your metrics should be whatever really makes sense to you and allows you to convey your message to your executive. So unfortunately, that's a bit of a difficult answer. The architecture component, some people go down the TOGAF line. Some other people just have the normal, you know, enterprise architecture frameworks. Either one will work. We have a bunch of wiki entries where people search for how do I authenticate, and they get a page that says this is how you authenticate for these different technologies, and that works just as well.
Okay, fantastic. Next question, any pitfalls to watch out for when building the security program and associated capabilities?
Yes. So probably taking on too much is a big area that people steer themselves wrong with. The best idea is to, you know, start simple and build up from there. Don't, you know, if you're in organizations quite immature, then don't start implementing an ISO 27001 framework from day one. Okay, sure, look at the framework to guide you and pick the things that make sense for you, but to be honest, look at the highest risks and see how you're going to address those ones would be my starting point, and then kind of build out from there. From a security capability perspective, from resourcing perspective, well, you know, obviously you need to have the strategy in place, or you need to have some sort of strategic capability. Having operational stuff happen first is not a bad idea, mainly just to get the main problem sorted out. But you need to have a number of resources that allow you to go and fix those repeatable issues. So if you're fixing the same thing over and over again, then that's probably the place to start. If you're doing a review and you find that you've got thousands of dormant accounts, then start with that. Small bites is basically the quickest answer there.
Okay, fantastic. Look, just another quick one, more a bookkeeping one, a question around whether the session will be shared. It absolutely will be, and you'll get a recording of this session via email, and we'll also be posting it onto our website. So if you've come in a bit late, you will be able to access that in its entirety.
And I believe you should be able to see the handout down the bottom as well, and you should be able to just download it from there.
Sure. Look, we've probably got a couple more minutes, and what I'm keen on doing is ensuring that we address the poll questions before everybody kicks off at the end of the hour. But what we'll do is we'll go through a few more questions. One in particular, any other threat models that you would suggest, examples quoted there are Stride, or control frameworks that you would recommend?
Yeah, so Stride, I think, is actually a very good framework, especially for threat modeling. Threat modeling can be quite confronting when you first look at it, because it is a very structured way, but it is a very good way to get into the nuts and bolts of things. So it might actually be easier than sometimes doing a risk assessment by doing the threat modeling, because it guides you a little bit quicker to where you want to be. For sure. I mean, threat modeling, we might actually put that on the list of a future webinar, because I know one of the lads in Canberra is working quite heavily on that, and he enjoys that one. So that would be a good one.
Yeah, we can definitely capture that. I think from what our experience is to date, is the threat modelings tend to either be very infrastructure weighted or very application or code weighted.
Yeah. And
we're trying to do a little bit of work to join those two elements up. And that's certainly something that we could discuss at the next webinar. Next question, any recommendations around secure coding standards?
Oh, I would start with OWASP, to be honest. OWASP has like a 365-page document, or roughly, plus examples of secure coding standards. If you've been told for a PCI, for example, to have a secure coding standard, I'd go and download that one. That's by far the most comprehensive one that I've come across.
Okay. Look, the next question talks about what metrics do you find resonate best with your clients' executives? I think the metrics question is actually coming up a fair number of times, so that may again be a topic for future discussions.
Yeah, the best metrics are the ones that go green, to be honest. Execs like seeing green, I don't necessarily like seeing red. It is quite a challenge to get technology metrics into an executive metric. For example, yeah, how many viruses did you have last month, or how many viruses did you send out last month? Well, that's kind of interesting from an operational perspective, but an executive probably doesn't necessarily care about that. So whatever you can wrap it out, and I'm happy to take that one offline and talk more about that.
Okay, and I think we've got one more. Do detailed descriptions exist for each maturity level, 0 through to 5, across each NIST subcategory?
Oh, the NIST framework, I believe, does, but there's nothing stopping you from doing the COVID one that we use in ours, and kind of either make up your own that makes sense, or use those ones as a guideline. So the ones that we use are slightly modified, but for the technology component, because the COVID one doesn't actually address technology, they only address policy, but I believe it is there.
All right, fantastic. And look, that's very timely. We've reached the end of the questions and we've reached the end of our hour. So what I'm going to do now is very quickly share with you the poll results, and then I'm going to wrap up. So the results are your executives more aware or less aware of your organization's security risks than they were 12 months ago? Again, a resounding more, 91%. That might be something to do with the amount that we're seeing in the press at the moment, but that's a very compelling result.
That's good.
The next result. What best describes your organization's plan for information security and compliance? Again, 66% are currently developing a security and compliance plan. So hopefully you've been able to get a fair bit out of today. And 19 are looking to do it within the next 12 months, and 16% are looking to continue to manage that
Nice.
and based on their current plan. And the last one, do you regularly measure and report on security and compliance to stakeholders? 39% are saying yes, and 61% are saying no. So again, interesting results. Look, just like to again thank you all very much for taking an hour out of your busy schedule to join us.